Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Am I on? Yes, I am on. Well, let me hopefully be like the 10th person today to say to you, welcome to Five Rivers Church. We are so glad you are here. And my hope for you is that you will see, hear, or experience something that will make you want to come and be with us again next week or the week after or at some point in the future. If you are a guest with us today, let me let you know that we have a way for you to follow along with what's going on today. There are some things in our sermon notes that might be helpful and valuable to you. So if you're a guest or you just don't have our church app, there's a QR code going to be right up here on the screen. We invite you to take a picture of that with your smartphone or smart device. That will take you right to our sermon notes. The scriptures are there. There's some a little bit of notes in there, and there's an image that we're going to refer to a little bit later on that might be helpful to you as well. If you're a regular attender here, hopefully you know what to do by now. Just open your app, click on that current series tab. You'll find the sermon notes for today. And if you brought a paper Bible with you, then we're going to invite you to open that and turn that to Matthew chapter 13. We're going to begin reading in a little while here, just a few minutes, in verse 24. So if you brought your paper Bible, open it up to Matthew 13. We'll be reading shortly from verse 24. Last week, if you weren't able to be with us, whether you're listening online or you're here in the space with us, Tracy led us through the parable of the mustard seed and the yeast. And if you're one of those people who pays close attention to like order and things like that, then you may notice that the sermon was a little bit out of order in terms of the text, right? Because we skipped over a little bit of text. And to be completely honest with you, Tracy and I really just kind of miscommunicated who was supposed to do what weeks ago. And what's really cool about that is that I said a few weeks ago, Tracy would be talking about the parable of the weeds. Well, secretly, if I'm totally honest with you, I was really kind of bummed about that because I wanted to teach the parable of the weeds. And later that week, Tracy came in and was like, Brian, I'm planning on the mustard seed and the yeast. And I was secretly like, yes, because I didn't want to have to talk about that. And so it worked out really well. God is like really good at stuff like that, right? Working things out. And so if you weren't able to be with us, Tracy talked about the mustard seed and the yeast. And really, the crux of what he talked about last week was this idea that God can take our acts of generosity, radical generosity, little things that we do that we express generosity. He can take those really small things and grow them into something really big and change the world. And that was the truth that Tracy pulled out of the yeast and the mustard seed. If you didn't get a chance to hear that and you want to go back and listen to it, I encourage you to do it. It's a good sermon. He also, though, talked about Pardes, which we're not going to talk about today. We'll revisit this again in future sermons, but Pardes is just this biblical hermeneutic that the Jews would use. Hermeneutic just means Bible interpretation. I don't want to get into all that, but he covered some good stuff there. So I encourage you to go back and check that out. You can go out on YouTube and find that mustard seed and yeast, or you can find it through our app in our messages section. This week is going to look a little bit different from previous weeks because we're not going to talk about Pardes. In fact, we're going to let Jesus do his own explaining today because Jesus gives a parable and then he explains his parable. And so we're going to jump right in to Matthew chapter 13, starting in verse 24. This just happens to be immediately after Jesus teaches the parable of the soils or the parable of the sower. Wow. My microphone is going to be, I can't stop moving. Stop moving. Wow. That's really funny. So right after Jesus gives the parable of the soils, Matthew records these words from Jesus. Jesus told them another parable, verse 24. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, the enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from? An enemy did this, he replied. And the servants asked him, Do you want us to go and pull them up? No, he answered, because while you're pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn. Now, a few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to kind of lay some groundwork for this hidden series that we're doing. And part of the time I spent in my sermon talking about the importance of unlearning. Sometimes we find ourselves in a place where we have to unlearn so that we can relearn. And we talked about how this process is sometimes referred to as deconstruction. And the purpose of deconstruction is reconstruction, so that you can take something apart, identify its individual parts and pieces, and then put it back together again, and you can kind of get a feel for how it works. We talked about how some of you are mechanical like that. You like to take things apart and understand how they work. Sometimes when we find ourselves in a place of needing to deconstruct or unlearn something, it's because something is wrong with it. How many of you can relate to this? You've had something in your house and it's broken or it's not working the way it's supposed to, and what's your first inclination? Men, mostly, not that women don't do this too, but guys, what do? We dig in there and we start taking it apart, right? What's the worst that's going to happen? It already doesn't work, right? So if it's a washing machine or whatever, take it apart, try to figure out what's broken in it, right? Usually you end up having to call a professional, okay? But sometimes you can diagnose and figure it out. Anyway, the point here is this. Sometimes we find ourselves in a place where we find, man, my faith just isn't really like working. Something's wrong. I'm not feeling in a place that I feel like I'm right. God is speaking to my spirit and asking me to maybe unlearn something so I can relearn it. And so we relearn and we find ourselves reconstructing our faith. And I want you to know that I try really hard when I give sermons not to make sermons about me, okay? That I try not to make it just my opinions and all about me. But today is going to be a little different because this passage, the ideas communicated in this passage have been so instrumental in my own faith journey, in my own reconstruction, if you will. And so I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit of how this passage has impacted me in my journey. And so let's just go back really quick and revisit what Jesus has said. He's basically said, hey, there's this farmer who planted good seed in a field. While he was sleeping and no one was paying attention, an enemy came and sowed weeds. After some time has passed, the weeds and the wheat begin to sprout, and eventually the little sprouts come on and the fruit becomes visible, and you can tell that, wait, some of these are wheat, but some of these are also weeds. What has happened? And the master says, yeah, I planted wheat, but an enemy has come and he's messed it up and he's planted weeds in my field. And so they say, well, let's go out and dig them up. We should go out and tear up the weeds. And the master says, no, don't tear them up. Let them grow until the harvest. And at that point, we'll bundle them together and we'll burn the weeds and we'll put the wheat into the barn. For so much of my faith journey, my journey walking with Christ, I feel like I completely misunderstood and misapplied this parable. And I think it's pretty easy to do, really, okay? Because let's think about it for just a second. Jesus is talking about a harvest here, right? He's talking about a field that gets planted, there's wheat and there's weeds, and he says when the harvest comes, we're going to take care of it. Now, I don't know about y'all, okay? But when I hear Jesus talk about harvest, I think, well, when else has Jesus talked about harvest? And there's this really interesting passage in Matthew chapter 9 that we covered, I don't know how many months ago that's been now, because we're moving at a kind of a slow pace. But, you know, you go back to Matthew chapter 9, there's this interesting thing that Jesus says about the harvest. And in fact, I want to go back and actually read it together. So what we're going to do, you're going to see it up on the screen, or if you're following along with our sermon notes, you'll see it there. Matthew chapter 9, 35 through 38, I want you to hear these words. Jesus, Matthew says, went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. And then he said to his disciples, and I need you to hear this, everybody pay attention here. The harvest is what? Plentiful, but the workers are few, he says. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. I don't know about you, but when I hear that, I think, oh, wow. Jesus is basically saying he needs some help. All right, is that what y'all hear there? I need some help because the harvest is plentiful and the workers are few. So pray that God will send more of us out into the field to work. Now, it's pretty important here that when we compare this parable to what Jesus has just said in the other parable, that we don't get just a little bit confused and start putting the two as if they're the same thing. Because I think harvest is harvest, work is work. Now I know what I'm supposed to do. I need to get out in the field and bundle up them daggone weeds. Get them ready for burning. What I think is really important here is that in Matthew chapter 9, Jesus gives a call to action. Are y'all with me? He gives a definite call to action. If you go back and read chapter 9, you'll find Jesus doing all kinds of things where he's making a difference in the world. He's out there showing compassion to people. He's meeting them where they are. He's identifying and seeing people who need to experience kingdom. He's proclaiming good news. He's healing the sick. He's having compassion on them. Sometimes we need to get out in the field and meet people where they are because Jesus says, I need more people out doing what I am doing. And part of the reason for this is, and Jesus says it, the people who are supposed to be shepherding them are not. The people who are supposed to be doing this are not doing it. And so we need workers to get out in the field and bring kingdom. Let's think back to the Sermon on the Mount. My friend John Kessler, who's sitting right out here in the area. Don't everybody look at him. He'll probably get weirded out. But my friend John, we were having coffee earlier this week, and he said something that he said before, but it really hit me this week. He said that there's this idea that the Sermon on the Mount is the single greatest piece of information ever communicated to mankind. And if that's true, then it should be the reference point for everything we do when we talk about bringing kingdom. And so, if we think about what Jesus is saying here to get out in the fields, he's saying to get out in the fields and bring kingdom. We need more workers in the fields bringing kingdom. Not in some future time, in some future place, but when, folks? Right now. Right now. Now, I don't know about you, okay? But I understood the impetus of this quote from Jesus. I'm like, hey, Jesus, sign me up. Like, I'm ready. I'm ready to get out in that field. Do some work to help God bring in his harvest. And then I hear Jesus give a parable like this one, right? Jesus gives this parable, and I don't know about y'all, but I'll tell you something that comes really naturally to me is identifying wheat from weeds. Or at least trying to. Some of you are like, no, not me. We love to do this. We love to categorize and label people, do we not? If I ask you to raise your hands if you're a Republican, don't do this. But then if I ask you to raise your hand if you're a Democrat, and I ask you to raise your hand if you're an independent, you would be able to do that, right? And we all have to have a label. And it's not just that, it's so many things. We got to have labels. We label each other. It's what we do. It comes very naturally to me. Maybe some of you aren't like me. But man, this comes super easy to me. I want to identify the wheat and the weeds. I want to recognize the fruit. And then much like the parable, the workers in the parable, I want to get rid of the weeds, folks. Yeah. Oh, man. Now, none of you ever want to do that. But I, at times, want to get rid of the weeds. And I especially want to do this early on in my faith journey. And I didn't want to just identify them, folks. I wanted to label them, call them out, tell them that they're a weed and I'm wheat, and then get them out of the way so kingdom can do what kingdom does. Keep it pure from the evil influences of empire. And if we're all really honest, this just kind of makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, let's be real, okay? Are weeds good for wheat? Nope. So if we just use some common sense, if you're looking at this in farming, what are you going to do when you see weeds? You're going to get rid of them. But the master in this parable says, no, don't pull the weeds. Let them grow together, and then at harvest, we'll separate them. Now, if you're like me and you're reading this parable, you're like, okay, Jesus, I'm with you. So when is harvest? So if I was going to tell you, hey, when you plant corn, when it's time for harvest, go out and plant, go harvest your corn. When are you going to do that, folks? When are you going to go harvest the corn? You're going to go harvest the corn when the fruit is ripe and it's ready to be harvested, right? Yes? So in my world, I'm like, okay, Jesus, as soon as I see the fruit is ready, I'm going to go out and do the harvest. So when I start to see the difference between the wheat and the weed is gone, baby. That's just how we're going to do it. When a plant matures, when its fruit is visible, and when it's ready, then we can tell the difference. Because when somebody's young in their faith, those of you who have been Christ followers for a while, it's hard to tell, right? I don't know if they're really serious. I don't know if they're really in. They're not really mature yet. We got to give them some time. But once we start seeing that negative fruit and we know they're a weed, out. There's no place here for you. And folks, this is basically my understanding. My own family, like I treated my own family terribly when I saw them doing things that weren't wheat-like. When they were weeds, I'm like, you're a weed and you need to get with it or get out. And I don't like to admit that, but that's the reality. And see, here's the problem. This creates a significant problem for us because we don't really have the qualifications, as much as we would like to think we do, to identify wheat and weeds. Now I'm going to shoot a picture up on the screen. Actually, Sam's going to shoot a picture up on the screen. And this is a picture of a wheat plant and a tare. Okay? Now, when you look at these two things side by side, okay, you can probably figure out which one is wheat and which one is a tare because there's only one of each, right? And they're right next to each other. Now, I want you to imagine that there's a field of millions, hundreds of thousands of these plants, and they're growing all together, and you have to, one at a time, pull them apart to identify the difference. Are you all following me right now? These two things look incredibly similar, do they not? Incredibly similar. One of them is wheat, and one of them is a weed. Now, here's what I find really interesting. This parable on the surface seems pretty clear to me. It doesn't seem all that confusing. But what happens is, after Jesus goes on and tells the parable about the yeast and the mustard seed, which Tracy talked about last week, the disciples find themselves in a home with Jesus, and they ask him a question. They're like, Jesus, can you please explain the parable of the weeds? Now, they don't ask him, or at least we don't find it recorded that they're asking him about the mustard seed or the yeast. They seem to have gotten that one. But something about this parable piques their interest, and they're like, Jesus, we don't understand this parable. Something about what Jesus has said has caused them issues. And so they say, Jesus, explain to us the parable. And I want you to hear Jesus' response. This is beginning in verse 37. Jesus answered, "The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the people of the kingdom. The weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels." And then Jesus goes on, he explains, listen, as the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man is going to send out his angels, and they're going to weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They'll be thrown into the blazing furnace where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, and the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Whoever has ears, let him hear. And folks, I got to be honest with you. For so much of my faith journey growing into my role, even as a pastor when I was younger, the part of this passage I focused on was that there's going to be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That there's going to be a fire waiting for those weeds. And so, man, we got to do everything we can to get those weeds out of here. Because the righteous, that's me, the righteous, we're going to shine like the sun with our Father in his kingdom. That's good news, right? I mean, that's good news. If you're wheat. And I'm not saying that we should ignore this part of the passage. I'm just saying that that's the part I was like, yay, God, go Jesus. And recently, as I have begun doing some unlearning and some deconstruction and my subsequent reconstruction, I learned that I had never really understood what Jesus is trying to say in this parable. Not that I hadn't read it before, just simply that I had chosen not to really understand it. I didn't really want to accept it for what it was. Because for me, it's easier just to not reconcile the difference between the harvest in chapter 9 and in chapter 13. It's easier just to let them coexist. It's easier just to be like, we can't have weeds in our midst because they're a pain in the backside and they mess stuff up and it's uncomfortable. And I don't want weeds in my field. And so for me, I had to come to a place where I was like, wait, there are differences between these harvests. And in one of them, Jesus is calling me to action. And in another one, he's explaining what his kingdom is like. They're not the same thing, and so we can't just draw a parallel and pretend that they are. Here in Matthew 13, there's a comparison that Jesus is trying to draw. He's saying the kingdom is like. The kingdom is like. And I think Jesus wants his disciples to understand an important truth, and not just his disciples, but all the other people who are going to follow him. Then and now, that's you and me and anyone who will partner with God to bring kingdom. And so what I want to do is take a minute and break this down. I want to share with you a couple of truths that I have come to understand from this particular explanation of Jesus' parable. Because this has been so instrumental to how I engage with and treat people who I may feel are weeds. And I know some of you are judging me right now. Brian, you're not supposed to think anybody's weeds. Yeah, I understand. I know. I'm still growing there, right? But here are some things I want you to think about. Jesus says the field in this parable represents what? The world. Jesus says the field represents the world. And this is important because how big is the world? Oh, what is it, Thomas? It's pretty big, isn't it? How many of you have been everywhere in the world? Oh, nice. Yeah, none of us have been everywhere in the world, right? It's a pretty big place. I don't think we could cover every square mile. We'd have to live to be really old to do that. The world is really big, but the whole big world is the field. Not just those areas where you feel like kingdom activity is happening. So you look around and you be like, well, the church is the field, baby. Jesus sowed good seed, and that good seed can be found in the church. Places where you look around and you think people are doing good things. Well, that's the field. No, the field is the entirety of the world. And here's where this matters. This is something that God had to reveal to me, and I'm not saying he'll reveal this to you, but he did reveal it to me. It came through to my heart and my soul. That means that there is wheat growing in places where I don't think wheat can grow. You see, that means wheat is growing in places where I don't believe it can grow. It also means that weeds are growing in places where we think they might be wheat. We lean into our own understanding and our own knowledge to identify the difference. And Jesus says, no. The field is the entire world. And in the entire world, there is wheat and there are weeds. Another really important thing to note here is that the harvest that Jesus talks about in Matthew 13 is not right now. Now that's hard, right? Because we're like, whoa, Brian, what do you mean? Well, Jesus is pretty clear. When is the harvest, according to what he says in his explanation? At the end of the age. In other words, it is a time yet to come. It is not now. So if the harvest is not now, are we supposed to be bundling up the weeds? What is the answer? No. Here's another truth, and this one smacked me in the face really hard. And this is the one that's been probably the most difficult for me to kind of really accept and really engage with on a very personal level. The harvesters in this parable are angels of God, not us. We are not harvesters. And some of you are like, whoa, what? Yeah. Jesus is pretty clear. These are Jesus' words. And I had a hard time with this because I thought, well, wait a minute. If I'm not the harvester, then what is my role in this parable? What do I even have to do? There's no action for me to take here. I don't understand. Why would Jesus give this parable if there's not something for me to learn and not something for me to do? Because I'm a task guy. And any of you who are task people who are like, I got to find out what I need to do. You look at the parable and you think, well, who am I in the parable? And here's what I've come to understand. I've come to understand that my role in the parable is the servant who came to Jesus, well, the master, and said, should we take out the weeds? Should we go and take out the weeds? I have come to understand that my place, if I need to find a place to fit into this parable, I'm the worker, the servant in the field. And this is really important. I need you to really think about this, okay? The servants come to the master and say what? Didn't you plant good seed in your field? Now, how would they know that there was not good seed planted in the field unless they were out there paying attention to it, folks? Are you with me? You see, these servants are out working in the field, and that's why they notice that there are tares growing among the wheat. These are people who've been tasked with caring for the field, and so they identify a problem. And naturally, they go to the master and they say, hey, you've given us a job to do. We've identified it. Do you want us to go out and complete the task and pull the weeds? Let's read it again, shall we? Let's go back. We're going to pull up verse 28, the end of verse 28. The servants, and I want you to know, I have highlighted words here because this is really important. The servants asked him, do you want who? Us to go out and pull them up. Jesus, or the master, I should say, says to them, no, because while you, and who's he talking to? The servants, while you are pulling them up, you may uproot the wheat with them. Are you following me so far? Let's continue reading. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters. At that time I'll tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn. Folks, this is important. The servants, the workers, and the harvesters are not the same people. You see, so often in our Christian journey, we want to be both. We want to be the worker and we want to be the harvester. And we are not called to do that. Jesus makes it pretty clear here that the servants and the harvesters are different people. Jesus doesn't say, hey, at the time of harvest, I'll have you go out and then bundle them, does he? Does he say that? He doesn't even use the same word. Harvester and worker aren't even the same word in the original languages, folks. These are different people. And so here's what we need to understand. Let me say it this way. This is what God has helped me to understand. I am not now, nor will I ever be, capable of, qualified to, or expected to be a harvester. That role belongs to the angels that God will call and send out for that purpose at some point in time in the future. Because I'm not a harvester, you know what I don't need to do, folks? I don't need to busy myself with trying to identify wheat and weeds. Some of you are like, whoa, what? I'm not a harvester. I don't need, Jesus even goes so far as to say, don't worry about it. He says, let them what, folks? Grow together. Until what? Till the harvest. I don't need to busy myself with identifying wheat and weeds. I don't need to worry about labeling them. I don't need to worry about separating them. You know what I do need to do, folks? I need to be out in the field. Yep, I need to be out in the field, working in partnership with God, who's the owner of the field, to tend all the plants in the field while they grow, wheat and weeds together side by side, tending equally with compassion and love and care, and spreading the good news to both of them equally. And as I do, I partner with God in bringing kingdom. When I spread the good news, when I show love and compassion to whoever, whether they're a wheat or they're a weed, is not my concern. I simply go and be the hands and feet of Jesus to people who are overlooked and excluded by empire and desperately need kingdom. People who are harassed and helpless because those who are supposed to be shepherding them are not. So if you're here today and you're in this physical space, or if you're listening or watching online, and you do not consider yourself to be a follower of Jesus, because maybe you've had some not so great experiences, right? My hope is that hearing these words and diving with us together into this parable might give you some insight and understanding how sometimes followers of Jesus misunderstand and misapply what Jesus wants for us to do. That with the best of intentions, we sometimes get it wrong. And we cause hurt and harm and pain by labeling people as weeds My hope for you is that you can find it in your heart to recognize that this is not Jesus' original intent. But sometimes his followers get it wrong. Jesus' intent for you is to be treated with the same dignity, respect, love, care, and compassion as everyone else, as every other plant in the field. I'm asking you to consider that maybe someone who caused you harm did so with good intentions. But they need a new understanding of what it means to partner with God in bringing kingdom. And I can say that because there's a time in my life, and there probably are going to be others, when I was that person. And so I ask anybody who I may have harmed to find it in their heart not to hold that against God. Do not hold that against Jesus, because I may have gotten something wrong. If you're here today and you're watching online or listening in another place, and you consider yourself to be a follower of Jesus, I'm going to ask you this question. What might this understanding, and I'm not saying you have to adopt my understanding, but what might this mean for you? How might this impact your understanding of your role in working in the field as opposed to harvesting it? To tending the field, both the wheat and the weeds, with love and compassion until the harvest comes. Scott is going to come up, and he is going to lead us in a few moments of meditation. Okay, I know that's a new agey word, but Scott's going to lead us in some thoughts about communion. So I'm going to ask you to give your attention to